Jack's memo says a lot and not a lot. What more context do we know about why and why now?
Well, look, I mean, Jack has always marched to the beat of his own drummer. You take one look at him today, and you can tell that. He also, as you say, remarkably, has run two public, very high-profile companies. I think it's a bit of a surrender and an acknowledgement that, you know, his management of Twitter as a public company is facing some significant challenges. As you mentioned, Elliott Management has a stake. Silver Lake Partners has a stake. There have been peace treaties in the past, but they want this company to grow, and it has lagged. It's lagged other tech companies, which have tripled their market cap. It's grown maybe 76% in its stock price since Jack took over, and that's compared to an S&P 500 that's probably twice that growth in that time. So I think that investors were going to want more. They do want more from Twitter than Jack has been able to provide.
The most we get in terms of an explanation here, David, is that Twitter is ready to move on from its founders. Do you see that at all as a rebuke to what Mark Zuckerberg is doing, doubling down with Meta?
Yes, I do. In fact, I think it would be very hard to read Jack's memo to his staff today without hearing an implicit criticism of Zuckerberg, especially sort of far down in there when he says, you know, some founders choose their ego over their company. I mean, who has chosen their ego more recently than Mark Zuckerberg in renaming his company over his own personal obsession with the metaverse in a way that really confounds more or less everyone else? But I do think, you know, Brad's right. And it's great to be here with you, Brad. Square is a company that has so much more potential than Twitter. It's not even funny in the long run. And, you know, he's also been at Twitter for a very, very long time. And he was pressured by the investors to get out. So it adds up.
Well, it's also interesting given that when he took over as CEO of Square, everybody thought that he would eventually leave his role as the CEO. When he took over as CEO of Twitter, everyone thought he would leave his role as CEO of Square, and he never did. And now we see the reverse happening. Sort of the biggest clue we've gotten as to his interests now was a couple of months ago. He said if he wasn't working at Twitter or Square, he'd be working on something else. Take a listen to what he had to say then.
If I were not at Square or Twitter, I'd be working on Bitcoin. If it needed more help than Square and Twitter, I would leave them for Bitcoin. But I think, I believe both companies have a role to play, and I think anything that we can do as companies to help also find the right intersection between a corporate narrative and a community open narrative is for the best.
Meantime, both Twitter and Square have been doubling down on cryptocurrency. And of course, the person who is replacing Jack has been the CTO of Twitter, also worked at Twitter for more than a decade, PARAG AGRAWAL. What does this promotion of a technical insider, Brad, tell you about the future of Twitter?
Well, look, this is someone who has worked with Jack for the past 6 years and has been at Twitter for 10 years. I don't think it signifies that significant a change in direction. It's interesting. He's very technical. He's now yet another of these very high-profile IIT graduates who are now running another Silicon Valley company. There's Microsoft and Google and Palo Alto Networks and IBM and so many others. He's tweeted very infrequently. It's sort of surprising. It'll be interesting to hear what his vision is. I mean, you mentioned the crypto project at Twitter. It's called Blue Sky. He's been running that. It's been always a little ethereal to me and unclear what that means for Twitter as a product. You know, David was making this great point about Microsoft and Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg and this pivot into the metaverse. And we kind of joked that Facebook has been reinventing itself willy-nilly and copying its competitors. But, you know, there's an argument to be made that sometimes the only thing worse than doing that is not doing that. And Twitter has remained fairly stagnant, fairly, the same over the past 5-6 years. So it will be interesting to see if the new CEO really has a different vision for Twitter.
Now, some of the things that Jack did accomplish, Twitter is now profitable, and he did take a significantly different stance on President Trump's account than other social media companies. He banned President Trump permanently from Twitter. Facebook hasn't done that. YouTube hasn't done that. David, do you think that decision took a toll?
I think it took a big toll, Emily, and it, to me, is not entirely certain that it's not related to this move. I think, you know, what I hear is that he actually has not been in evidence in the offices of both companies very much in the last year or so. Of course, the pandemic's been underway, so a lot of us have been away. But I think that, you know, you alienate a lot of people when you ban Donald Trump from Twitter. And I think that may have really burdened him with some of the pushback that he got as a result. Although in reality, the story they say anyways, that he didn't make that decision. He was off on a, you know, desert isle in the Pacific somewhere, and one of his deputies made that decision, and I believe that. But he is the CEO, and he was where the buck stopped, so he got blamed for it.
Well, and to be fair, many people also applauded that decision. Well, many people also applauded that decision and thought Twitter was making, you know, the right but hard call. So quickly, one last question, David. He's left a couple of times and come back. Is Jack really gone for good?
Gone from Twitter? Yeah, I would say he is. I mean, you know, the thing about Square we really have to remember is this is a company that could become one of the world's great financial companies. And if he succeeds in incorporating his vision about the importance of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin into Square's future, when it's already a $100 billion company, one of the most valuable financial companies in the world by many measures, and with a huge runway ahead of it that you really can't see for Twitter based on its current trajectory, he's got way more on his plate already. He does not need to come back to Twitter. He's got the pride of authorship. That is probably plenty.